Make sure we have some audio here. Perfect. Okay. So, what we are going to talk about this week is doubly apropos because we're going to be talking about Sfiras HaOmer, counting of the Omer, which is doubly apropos because it's a mitzvah that's in this week's parsha, and it's something that we are currently in the middle of working our way through. So, we're going to have a bit of an introduction about the way the Jewish calendar works. This is going to be an important part of understanding all the different parts of this. So, you'll sometimes hear people say that the Jewish calendar, our calendar, is a lunar calendar, which it's not technically. It's perhaps the right way to describe it might be, it's a lunar solar calendar. It's a combination. Now, what that means is that, yes, the months, the lengths of the month, when a month begins, when a month ends, is determined by the cycles of the moon. That is lunar in nature. Now, an example that you'd see of a strictly lunar calendar is Muslims have a strictly lunar calendar. Now, something interesting, if you interact with people who practice Ramadan, you'll notice, and this is going to highlight why our calendar is not strictly lunar, but it's a lunisolar calendar. People who observe Ramadan, for example, they observe Ramadan for a full month on their calendar, but because the secular calendar the Gregorian calendar has 12 months, the months average 30 and a half days, more or less, right? They alternate more or less, with the exception of February, between 30 and 31 days, averaging about 30 and a half. The lunar cycle is 29 and a half days. So Jewish months, lunar months, alternate between 29 and 30 days. At the end of 12 months, if the lunar cycle is approximately 1 day shorter than a solar month, by the end of the year, you've lost, about 12 odd days relative to the solar year, and it's a little bit less because of February. So we've lost, let's say, 10-ish days approximately per year. So if, let's say, 1 year, the lunar year, the Jewish calendar, and the Gregorian calendar would start on the same day, the Jewish calendar would end 10 days earlier. In the second year, it would end 20 days earlier because it started 10 days earlier. The second Jewish year started 10 days earlier than the second Gregorian year, and it's 10 days shorter, so now it's going to be finish 20 days earlier. By the end of 3 years, it'll finish a full month earlier. By the end of 9 years, it'll finish a full season earlier. Right? And this is something that, for example, with Ramadan, you see that it actually moves its way all the way around the calendar, and it gets earlier and earlier and earlier, and it moves through the seasons. So, there's sort of a period of time when it's in the summer, which obviously makes fasting very difficult. It's long and it's hot, neither of which make it easy. And then there are times when it's in the winter. Obviously, it takes quite a number of years to get from one to the other, but that's the way that works. The reason our calendar is not like that is because it says in the Torah about Pesach, Shomer es Chodesh HaAviv, Pesach, because Hashem, in taking us out of Egypt, was considerate of our experience and specifically, intentionally took us out of Egypt in spring, so it should be the most pleasant possible circumstances. So to properly commemorate Pesach, ideally we should be commemorating it in the spring in the Northern Hemisphere. Now, if our calendar was strictly lunar, Pesach might have started out in the spring. Give it 9 years, it's going to be in the winter. 9 years later, it's going to be in the summer. 9 years later, it's going to be in the fall. And, after 36 years, it's back to spring again. But the Torah says it has to be in spring. How does that work? How can it be in spring continuously if the fact is the seasons are determined by the sun, but by the relationship between Earth and the sun? The seasons have nothing to do with the lunar calendar. So how is that going to work? And that's why we have the concept of a leap year in the Jewish calendar. Now, unlike a Gregorian leap year where there's one extra day in February, a Jewish leap year has an extra month. the way that we refer to a leap year in Hebrew, in Lashon HaKodesh, is actually Shana Me'uberes. Me'uberes literally means pregnant, because it's carrying the same way that a woman who is pregnant, a lady, a mother or mother-to-be who's pregnant, is carrying an additional partly formed person inside of her. A leap year is carrying an additional entire month, a substantial portion of a year within it. It's 13 years instead of 12. 13 months instead of 12. So what we end up with is the Jewish calendar relative to the seasons. It goes 10 days earlier, 10 days earlier, pushed back 30 days, 10 days earlier, 10 days earlier, pushed back, and it sort of oscillates back and forth. And this is why, when people ask, oh, when are the high holidays this year? Is it in September? Well, it varies, and it sort of, and if you pay attention, you'll notice it goes later, later, earlier. Later, later, earlier. It's more or less every third year. It's not exactly, because it's 7 out of 19 years. But our leap years are there to align the solar calendar with the lunar calendar, which is why it alternates, and in order to keep Pesach in the spring. Now, this is the part that's really of primary importance. Our months are determined by the moon. Right? In the time of the Beis Hamikdash, in the time of the Temple, in the time of the Sanhedrin, when we had a rabbinic court of sufficient authority, the way it worked was, and when we have the third Beis Hamikdash, may it be immediately, this practice will be restored. That the way Rosh Chodesh is determined is when we have witnesses who can bring testimony that can be validated that they saw the new moon, right? So what does the cycle of the moon mean? Because of the relationship between the sun and earth and the moon, the moon seems to get bigger and smaller. Really, obviously, what that means is that there are larger and smaller portions of the moon that are visible to us because of the way that the sunlight reaches it and then reflects back to us. So a lunar cycle, a lunar month begins when the new moon appears. We see a tiny little thin sliver of a moon, and then that sliver gets broader and broader, and a quarter of the way in, it's probably a bit more than half by that point, but let's say half-ish full. Middle of the month, and if you pay attention, you'll notice that generally on the 15th of the Jewish month, sometimes it's off by a day because of the approximations of the 29 and the 30, but more or less on the 15th day of the Jewish month, if you look up at night and the moon is visible, you'll see the moon is full. It's a full circle. And the next day you see there's a tiny sliver missing, and the next night you see the sliver that's missing is a little bigger. By the end of the month, there's only a sliver remaining. Then on the last day of the month, at the end of the month, it sort of disappears entirely, and then it reappears, a new sliver of moon emerges. So the Rosh Chodesh was determined by... So Rosh Chodesh, let's say that today is the first day of the Jewish month. This month can, by definition, be either 29 days or 30 days. Because it's 29 and a half days, the lunar cycle, depending on when the cycle begins in the day and the night cycle, it'll end up being either 29 days or 30 days. So if on the 30th day no one has seen the new moon appear, at that point we know the next day is the first day of the month, because it can never be more than 30 days. There's no such thing as a 31-day month. It's 29 and a half days. It's going to be either 29 or 30. So the 31st, if today is the first day of the month, the first day of the next month is either 31 days from now, 30 days from now, which is the 31st day, or the 30th day from now, which is in 29 days. So day 30 is either day 30 of this month or day 1 of the next month. If day 30 is not day 1 of the next month, then day 31 is automatically day 1 of the next month. It doesn't go beyond that. The question is, which day is it? And this is the reason why on Pesach, on Sukkot, outside of Eretz Yisrael, outside of Israel, we observe 2 days of Yom Tov, whereas in Eretz Yisrael, in Israel, they observe 1 day. And the reason is because in the time of the Beis Hamikdash, when the first day of the month was determined by witnesses, there was no way to know when the first day of the coming month was going to be. until you find out, did witnesses show up and give valid testimony or not? And they could show up, 10 minutes before sunset on the 30th day and give their testimony. Based in talks to them, checks them out. Yep, testimony is valid, it's legit. Boom, today is the first day of the month. You find out 10 minutes before sunset that today was actually Rosh Chodesh, the first day of the new month. Right, so by the time you get to Sukkot or to Pesach, it's 15 days in. Anyone within Israel had pre-WhatsApp and pre-Instagram and pre-TikTok. Anyone within the land of Israel had at that point been able to find out which day was Rosh Chodesh of this month, and therefore which day is the 15th day of the month, and therefore which day Pesach starts, which day Sukkot starts. Once you get beyond the borders of Israel, at that point, it took more than 2 weeks for the word to reach there. So outside of Israel, they didn't know, is today Pesach, is tomorrow Pesach? We don't know because we don't know when Rosh Chodesh was. It could only be one of these 2 days, because the last month was either 29 days or 30. We just don't know which one. And that's why they would observe 2 days of Yom Tov, because they weren't sure which one it was, so they had to keep both. And then eventually, in a couple days, in a week, they find out, and it's like a case of that, they know which one of the two it was supposed to be, but they had to keep both because they didn't know. Whereas in Israel, the first day of Yom Tov was 1 day because they knew. Now, the key thing here, the thing here that's most relevant to us in terms of what we're talking about today, is that unlike today, so the way it works today is our calendar has been fixed so that it sort of averages that out and it stays on, on course with the cycle of the months, because hypothetically, if it could be 29 or 30, you could have 29, 30, 30, 30, 30, 30, and it's like, hang on, that doesn't work. By that point, we're like 3 days behind, because it's not, if you have a bunch of 30s in a row, your average is now basically 30, not 29 and a half. After two cycles, which will be 4 months of your average being up, you're going to be off by a day or two. So now our calendar is organized, and we know at the beginning of the year exactly when Rosh Chodesh is going to be, and it's been set up in a way that works. It's true to the cycles of the moon. It just, everything works out. The Yom Tovs work out in a way that doesn't make anything too difficult. There are certain sort of combinations of Yom Tov and Shabbos that when this calendar was determined and set up, they, were sort of looking out to make sure that things wouldn't work out in a way that makes things more difficult than necessary. So we have a predetermined calendar now. But in the time of the Beis HaMikdash, any given month could be 29 days and it could be 30 days. There's no way to know until it happens. Which means, now because of the nature of things, now it more or less alternates almost consistently 29, 30, 29, 30, with some exceptions in some years. And again, that's because it's not exactly 29 and a half, and then when you have the leap years, it doesn't match up exactly so, but it's more or less, let's say, alternates 29 and 30. But, in the time of the Beis HaMikdash, when it was working with witnesses, it could get a little bit messy. What if Rosh Chodesh really was day 30, not day 31? This month is 29 days, but no witnesses happen to see. You end up off by a day. That means by next month, it's like things might not work out the way you expected. Or, and over time, things can get a little bit, so you might end up with 2 29-day months in a row, 2 30-day months in a row. It doesn't necessarily work out exactly precisely alternating. Also, because when that 29 and a half days falls out, it might be midday. It might be, it's not exactly 29 and a half, so it's not exactly the same time every day. It's close. So as that, if this month starts close towards the morning, the length of this month in terms of dates on the calendar is going to be very different to if the new day begins close to the evening. So it was variable. Now, keeping that in mind, there's something very unique about the Yom Tov of Shavuos. And we're going to sort of clarify what this has to do with Sphira. Oh, it's coming up now. If you look in the Torah, we know when Pesach is. Pesach is, the Torah tells us, Pesach has a date. That date is the 15th day of the month of Nisan. Sukkot has a date. The date of Sukkot is the 15th day of the month of Tishrei. Rosh Hashanah has a date. It is the 1st of Tishrei. Yom Kippur has a date. It is the 10th of Tishrei. The Yom Tov of Shavuos, which is a biblically mandated Yom Tov, it's a Yom Tov that's in the Torah, it doesn't actually have a date on the calendar in the Torah. Torah says, and it's in this week's Parsha, it's people can go through life without ever noticing this, because this is another one of those things. The way that it works now is, the way that our calendar is set up, is that it always falls on the 6th day of Shavuos, which works nicely because the 6th day of Shavuos is when the Torah was given. Perfect. And this is what we're going to be getting into and really breaking down. But the Torah doesn't say, and on the 6th day of Shavuos you shall observe, 6th day of Sivan, thank you, you shall observe Shavuos. The Torah says, starting... Ouch.
That would be a bombastic section.
I think the grocery stores would like that very much.
They would all quit.
They'd have like a week long of Fridays just for people to be able to buy enough food, but before. So I grew up working in a kosher bakery, so my mind automatically reverts to that trauma. So,
is that your family?
what?
The Glick's Bakery?
The Glick's Bakery in Melbourne, yes.
Oh.
And if you want to hear the really cute irony, my family's bakery, my grandparents' bakery, that they built up from, nothing, both coming from the Holocaust without a pair of socks, to a massive business with many retail branches, lots of wholesale contracts, and selling things around the country. Their bakery was called Glick's Cakes and Bagels, and from the original primary retail store, well, not the original, but the main retail store for most of the time that they had the business, exactly, not even a block, half a block down the street, there was another bakery called Hamish Cookies. So there was Glick's and Hamish, and they were like, exact same market, competing within the same market, same, two bakeries. They specialized a little differently, but, they were very direct competition. And so there was Glick's and Hamish, and the Glick's bakery here is called Glick's Hamish Bakery. So they made some shalom bayis. Now, just to be clear, this is a side point and not really relevant, as that wasn't either, but just a quick story. When I talk about them being competition, they were technically competition, but a story that I heard about long after it happened that was it blew my mind, was that there was a incident at some point. I think the bakery Hamish down the road had some sort of fire, maybe all their equipment got destroyed. Number one, even you're talking about big industrial machinery. You don't just order that on Amazon, it shows up tomorrow ready to go. You have to order it, it takes time to come, it has to be assembled, costs a fortune. So they were going to be, ultimately out of business for quite a while until they could get back up and running. And my uncle, who was actually managing my grandparents' business at the time, reached out to them and told them that they were welcome to come and use the facilities when Glick's wasn't using them, so that they could get themselves back up and running to the degree possible. And these are companies that were literally competing within the same, and it's not New York City. There's not like, it's not like there's, suburbs and suburbs and suburbs of Jews and a shul every block in Borough Park, and there's just like these massive companies, and there's more than enough to go around. There's more than enough to go around. That's the way Hashem runs the world. But it's a very limited market. There were direct competition half a block away, and that was a real expression of the extent of the realness of his faith in Hashem, and the fact that what I'm going to have comes from Hashem. And the fact that someone else is competing has nothing to do with what I'm going to have. What I'm going to have is going to come from Hashem. And there's no reason why I should hurt someone else, or not even hurt someone else. It's not hurting someone, but if I have the opportunity to help someone out, and there's no way that comes at my expense. And so that was like an incredibly beautiful story. Anyways, we're going to try to reel it in a little. So, sorry? Right, so technically speaking, in the time of the Beis Hamikdash, right, so the Torah never says Shavuos is on the 6th day of Sivan. The Torah says, and on the 2nd day of Pesach, you will start counting for yourself 7 weeks, 7 complete weeks of 7 days each, and on the 50th day it will be Shavuos. The halachic definition of Shavuos is 50th day from the 2nd day of Pesach. We start counting Sfirah second night of Pesach, which is the beginning of the 2nd day, because that's how our calendar works. It begins at sunset, or it begins at nightfall. technically, officially. The nightfall and sunset thing is just a matter of lack of clarity of exactly when the night begins, technically. So the second day of Pesach is day 1. We count 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks. 7 complete weeks is 49 days. Day 50 is Shavuos. That is the halachic definition of Shavuos according to the Torah. That is what the Torah tells us in terms of when Shavuos is. So now the way it works is we have Nisan, Iyar, 30 days, 29 days. Consistently, Shavuos, the 50th day, is the 6th day of Sivan. In the time of the Beis HaMikdash, if Nisan was 29 days and Iyar was 29 days, the 6th day of Sivan is now a day earlier than it could have been. 50 days from the second day of Pesach is the same distance. It doesn't change. But the month of Sivan now started 1 day earlier. So now, when we get to day 50, it's going to be the 7th of Sivan, not the 6th of Sivan. What about if Nisan is 30 days and Iyar is 30 days? Now the 6th of Sivan arrives a day later. Same 50 days is 50 days. Now, when we get to 50 days, it's only the 5th of Sivan, not the 6th yet. So in the time of the Beis HaMikdash, Shavuos could very really be the 5th of Sivan, the 6th of Sivan, or the 7th of Sivan. And there was no way to know in any given year when that's going to be. Things are set up now that consistently it's on the 6th day of Sivan. So when we daven on Shavuos, when we say the Yom Tov prayer, the Yom Tov Tefillah on Shavuos, we say, Zman Matan Torah. This is the time of the giving of the Torah. What about in the time of the Beis HaMikdash? What if Shavuos is on day 5 of Sivan? On the 5th? What if Nisan and Iyar were both 30 days? 6th of Sivan is day 51 now from Pesach, second day of Pesach. Shavuos is on the 5th day of Sivan. The Torah wasn't given on the 5th day of Sivan, it was given on the 6th. We wouldn't actually say Zman Matan Torah Seinu in davening, because it's not. So there's this sort of idea that we have that the same way that Pesach is a commemoration of the Exodus from Egypt, we think of Shavuos as being a commemoration of the giving of the Torah. That's what we say, Zman Matan Torah Seinu. Technically speaking, it's not quite as simple as that. There are two different things going on. They're both true. There is a very deep connection and correlation between Shavuos and the giving of the Torah, but it's not technically, Shavuos isn't technically a commemoration of that. Shavuos is a celebration of the completion of 50 days from the Omer sacrifice, which was the second day of Pesach. That counting of 49 days begins the second day of Pesach. And the Torah says, and you will count for yourself 7 weeks of 7 days. And on the 50th day, it's Shavuos. Just to illustrate the extent to which this is the case, that Shavuos is determined by the passage of days, not by the date on the calendar. Let's say a person is traveling from here to Australia. It's the 10th day of the Omer. They get on a plane, they fly to Australia.
You gotta be careful which way you
They pass through one night. So they've counted one additional day on the Omer. When they land in Australia after that night, it's actually the morning 2 days later. You leave on Monday evening. You get there on Wednesday if you cross the date line. So you've jumped. There was one point in the flight when you jumped 24 hours in an instant, then time passes, so you don't have 24 hours ahead. You end up maybe 16, whatever it is. Don't even start. I'm going to be moderating a discussion by Neshamas this week on psychedelics, and maybe then we can talk about time and whether or not it's real. But
where is this class going to be?
It's organized by Neshamas. If you look up Neshamas, the mental well-being organization, they're doing it. So
that's why you got to be careful which way you travel to Australia right now.
Exactly.
You got to be real
So
careful.
if, let's say, it's the 10th day of the Omer, it's Monday, you get on a plane, you pass through one night. So for you, it says, and you shall count for yourself. If when you left here, it was the 10th day, you passed through one night, what day is it? It's 11th day since the second day of Pesach for you. It's also gone from Monday to Wednesday. So everyone in Australia now, for them it's the 12th day, but for you it's the 11th day at the same time. If you travel from here to Australia across the date line in between Pesach and Shavuos, you actually technically, according to many halachic opinions, and you know the Rebbe asserts this very strongly, you now have to observe Shavuos a day later than everyone else. Because when they're up to 12, you're up to 11. When they're up to 50, you're up to 49. So you have to go on the first day of Shavuos, when for everyone else it's Yom Tov and they're not putting on tefillin and they're in shul davening Yom Tov davening, you have to stay at home, put on tefillin where no one else sees because you don't want to make a whole thing. And then when everyone else is on the day after Yom Tov, for you that's the second day of Yom Tov.
Wait, so what would you do about like hearing the Spirit Sedibros?
It's an issue. Ooh. Now also because this is something that is halachically, let's say, this is the halacha, at least the way that, our community follows it. That's not to say that it's not contentious, and the Rebbe asserts very strongly that we should try to avoid getting ourselves in this position. Try not to cross the date line between Pesach and Shavuos, unless you're going both ways. Then you gain a day one way, you lose a day the other way, and then you're back to square one. You're even. It evens out. But this just emphasizes that Shavuos, not only is Shavuos calculated or determined by what the date is on the calendar, right? Because when you go from here to Australia, you leave here Monday, you get, let's change this up. You leave here Wednesday, you go through one night, you land there on Friday. Do you light candles tonight? Is it Friday night or is it Thursday night? It's Friday night. Because Shabbos, it doesn't say anywhere that Shabbos is determined by your experience. Shabbos is the seventh day of the week on the calendar, and it just happens to be, by the way, that because of Shabbos, the conversation in halacha about where the date line is extremely important. Because depending on where you draw the date line, and in a sense, the date line, it's basically west of the States, east of Australia. It just runs pretty much straight through water. So it doesn't actually affect anyone.
Like imagine you and your neighbors and two different
yeah.
Cool. But it's an ocean.
Now, but the question is, and this is a big conversation in halacha, like the date line, in a sense, is arbitrary, right? There's no physical characteristic that says, oh, yeah, we could see that's where the date line is. It's, in a sense, empirically, it's arbitrary. You just have to decide somewhere, because otherwise, if you keep traveling around, you're just going more and more forward or backwards in time, depending on which way you go.
But time's not real, so.
So, this is why, in halacha, where the date line is very, very important. Because when you go from here to Australia, have you gone back in time 8 hours, or have you gone ahead in time 16 hours? They're both equal in terms of our relationship with the sun. It's the same time of the day, but have you gone ahead to Wednesday morning, or have you gone back to Tuesday morning, when for you, or your original time in New York, it's Tuesday evening now? Which one is it? And that depends on where you draw the date line. So that's it's a very big and important conversation in halacha. We know when to keep Shabbos, but ultimately Shabbos is determined by the day of the week on the calendar. If I travel from one place to another place, okay, I skipped a day, but Friday's Friday and Shabbos is Shabbos, because that's the nature of the time and the place. But Shavuos isn't determined by the day of the week or the day on the calendar. It's determined by, and it says, and you will count for yourself. Shavuos is determined by the individual's experience of the passage of time. And if two people in the same place have had a different experience of the passage of time, because one crossed the date line, so one has only experienced 49 days and one has experienced 50 days, for one of them it's Shavuos and for one of them it's not. Question?
Yeah, so what about people who don't count the timer? They can't have cheesecake?
Yes, you definitely have to count the omer to earn your cheesecake.
Okay.
And 10,000 steps a day for all of the omer if you want to be able to afford the calories.
Oh.
So,
But it's not 50 days for them. Like, there are people who don't even know about.
okay, good. So that's part of where we're going to go. That's like the second stage of breaking it down. So really there are two... Now this is not to say that Shavuos has nothing to do with the giving of the Torah. If Shavuos had nothing to do with the giving of the Torah, we wouldn't say Zman Matan Torah Seinu. Right? We don't like, when the Anshe Knesset Gdola established the davening, when the wording of the davening that we say was set for Yom Tov, they didn't look through the calendar and see, what's everything that ever happened in history on this day? And we're going to say Zman and list all the 500 notable things that happened. It doesn't work that way. Right? If they chose to say Zman Matan Torah Seinu, this is the time of the giving of the Torah, obviously that's something that is inherently connected with the Yom Tov. The same way that on Pesach we say Zman Cherosenu, this is the time of our liberation because we are commemorating our being liberated from slavery in Egypt. If on Shavuos we say Zman Matan Torasenu, this is the time of the giving of the Torah, that means that Shavuos is inherently related to the giving of the Torah. So which one is it? Is it or isn't it? And the answer is, it's both. How, why, what? So, and this is really, honestly, this is something that is, I would say one of the really, you could say this honestly about what we talk about pretty much every week, but really this is, I would say, towards the top of the list of ideas and things that getting clarity in this changes everything. And it's so, so important. And that is that, one of my favorite things, two things can be true at the same time. Well, the truth is here, it's not really two things being true at the same time, but there are multiple things going on here. Right? And this is true, honestly, of everything in our experience. If it's true of our relationship with Hashem, it's true of our relationship with Torah, it's true of our relationship with co-workers and with family and with parents and with spouses and with kids and with friends. It's true of everything in our experience is complicated, and there are always multiple things happening at the same time. Right? It's true of our conscious experience. It's true of us inside, biologically, etc. This is true of anything that's real is complicated. And something that I say a lot is, when people ask, well, is it this or is it that? If it's a real conversation about things that that's a serious question, most of the time it's both. The question is, what's the balance? Like nature versus nurture. Anybody who's thinking about this seriously is not going to be arguing, no, it's nature and not nurture, or no, it's nurture and not nature. It's clearly not either one of those. It's clearly both. And the reality is that there's no consistent balance either. Right? Because in different things, the balance between them it varies. So it's a very similar thing here, that there are multiple things happening at the same time, and they're very, very different. Zman Matan Torasenu. What does that mean? That means the time of the giving of the Torah. And to get very specific here and very precise, it doesn't say the day on which we received the Torah. What's the difference? It's subtle. In both of if we were to say the day of the giving of the Torah, the time of the giving of the Torah, or the time of our receiving the Torah, we're describing the same event. But the question is, are we commemorating our experience of this event when we received it, or are we commemorating the event itself which empirically happened regardless of our experience? Hashem gave it to us. The extent to which we were present, the mood that we were in, what our experience of it was, irrelevant. It is the time when the Torah was given. It's got nothing, it doesn't depend on our participation, it doesn't depend on our state of mind, it doesn't depend on anything on our part. It's something that happened, and it happened regardless of our participation or lack thereof, etc. Hashem gave us the Torah. This is what happened on the 6th day of Sivan. The 6th day of Sivan is an objective day. It doesn't change. The 6th day of Sivan is the 6th day of Sivan regardless of our counting or not counting or the passage of time or not. Right, and just to illustrate this, going back to what we were saying about Shavuos, let's say someone flies from here to Australia and they're keeping Shavuos a day later than everyone else. On the 6th day of Sivan, if let's say this is someone who says the Tehillim for the day every day of the month, they're still going to say the 6th day, right? And if it's a Wednesday, they're still going to say, for the Shir Shel Yom, they'll say today is the 4th day of the week. It doesn't change the calendar date. Still the 6th day of Sivan. Hashem gave the Torah on the 6th day of Sivan. You did cross the date line, you didn't. You did count, you didn't. Doesn't matter. Hashem gave us the Torah, period. Nothing to do with our participation or input. This second aspect here, which is that very clearly Shavuos is technically, halachically determined by the counting of the Omer for the individual, to the extent that if you're in a place where your experience of the passage of time is different to everyone else's, not because you were tripping on mushrooms, but because you crossed the date line, then you're going to have Shavuos on a different day, which means that Shavuos, which again, Shavuos is inherently related to the giving of the Torah, even though the date halachically doesn't necessarily align with it all the time. But Shavuos is inherently related to the Torah and the giving of the Torah. Otherwise, we wouldn't say we're celebrating Shavuos, the time of the giving of the Torah. Which means that there is an aspect of our relationship with the Torah and our receiving of the Torah that is very much determined by our experience, by our work, by our progress through these 49 days. And if someone else is up to day 50 and I'm up to day 49, they get the Torah today and I get the Torah tomorrow. So there are multiple things that are happening here, right? Every single one of us is equally entitled to the Torah, has the exact same right to the Torah, has the same exact opportunity to have a relationship with the Torah, and the word opportunity there is very important. We don't necessarily all have the same relationship with the Torah. Why? Because any relationship is dependent on the two participants in that relationship. And if we, and that's the second part of it, is the counting. The same way, and this really, I wasn't even necessarily planning to go here, but now that I brought it up, it really, in a sense, aligns very much with the nature and the nurture thing. Right? There is a certain contribution that our genes make to the course of our lives and our experience. And nothing we can do is going to change that. More or less, for now. Our genes are what they are. And the predispositions that we have based on our genes are what they are, period. That doesn't mean that therefore we are necessarily, victims of, or that our experience in the course of our life is determined by our genes, because the choices we make and the way that we behave and the foods that we eat and the exercise that we do and the sleep that we get, etc., have an enormous impact. And yes, me and someone else eating the same foods are going to have different outcomes. Me and someone else doing the same level of physical activity, getting the same amount of the same quality of sleep, are going to have different outcomes because we have different genes. But for me, for every one of us, the outcome that we will have if we eat right and sleep right and move right is going to be different to the outcome we will have if we don't eat right and we don't sleep right and we don't move right. Clearly, both of these things are a substantial part of the picture. If our nature, if our genes didn't have a substantial impact, then two people, same diet, same exercise, same sleep, are going to have an almost identical experience. And that's clearly not the case. Why? Because you have different genetics. If it was just the genetics and not the behavior, then two identical twins who eat differently and sleep differently and move differently are going to have the same exact course of their life biologically, and that's clearly not the case either. Neither of these things they could be, but these things are both are almost diametric opposites from the way reality plays out. Our genetics play a huge role, and you know what? Sometimes we'll say it's not, it's not fair. It isn't. That's the truth. The bottom line is it's truth. It's the truth. We all have things about what we're born with that are not fair and that other people have, in which, they're more fortunate than us in that specific regard. We all have things like that. We all have things in which we're more fortunate and things in which we're less fortunate, but that doesn't change anything. It's no one's choice. It is what it is. But that's the thing that's most important. It is what it is. It's got nothing to do with us. You can't change that. Then there is a big part of the picture that we can change. Now, when it comes to these sorts of things, what I would say is that generally as a rule, if someone's busy getting caught up in all the things that are not fair that happen to them, whether it's their genetics or their history or their experience, etc., that might be true. And it often is the case. And everyone has this to some degree, some people to a much more substantial degree than others. It's true. Can you do something about that? No, you can't. But you know what? There's a huge part of your life that you can do something about. So take your energy and direct it towards the things you can do. And you know what? Instead of spending energy focusing on what's not fair, direct your energy to doing something you can do and to making a difference today and tomorrow and the next day. Because there are some things we can't do anything about and some things we can do something about. Now, when it comes back to Matan Torah, it's similar. I would say it's a little different, right? Because in this case, I would say that the suggestion I was giving, and yes, it is a bit of an oversimplification, and there are times to look back and to dig into things, etc. But it definitely shouldn't be where we put most of our energy most of the time for most people. When it comes to Torah, there is, I guess in a sense there's this overlap, but when it comes to Torah, yes, Hashem gave us the Torah. And Hashem gave us the Torah on the 6th day of Sivan. You counted 49 days, you counted 50 days, you counted 48 days, you didn't count any days, irrelevant. Hashem gave us the Torah, and that's the same for everyone. We all have the same opportunity for a relationship with the Torah. Spiritually, we all have identical genetics in terms of our ability to, the extent to which we are entitled to the Torah, the extent to which the Torah belongs to us, and the extent to which we can have a relationship with Torah. But remember, I said we all have the same opportunity. Opportunity for a relationship doesn't automatically become a relationship, right? An opportunity for a relationship means the opportunity is there if we decide to engage in pursuing and building and cultivating and maintaining this relationship. And that's where the counting comes into play. Shavuos happens when you counted your 49 days and day 50 happened. Someone else is up to day 51. That's them, not you. That's them, not me. You're up to day 49. I'm up to day 50. Okay, so for you, in your passage through this process, you're at one place. And for me, I'm at a different place. You have your own relationship, your own actual experiential relationship with Hashem and with Torah, and I have my own experiential relationship with Hashem and with Torah. In mine, I'm up to here. In yours, you're up to there. So I work my way towards the giving of the Torah on one day. You have worked your way towards the giving of the Torah on a different day, a day before, a day after. Now, to make these things more complicated, as we had the question before, what about if someone didn't count the Omer?
Scandal.
Sorry?
Scandal.
Oh,
For them.
not if someone became a Ger Tzedek and converted in the middle. There's no scandal there.
Okay.
Or someone became Bar Mitzvah in the middle, so that when they counted before it didn't count and now it does.
Now they
Alright,
get
so in that situation, they do get cheesecake.
Trying to do shit.
But
I'm not poskening, but.
I think you just did.
Oh!
Right, but point being,
Black cat, I'm ready.
let's say two people, there are two people in Melbourne, Australia, both of whom converted in the middle of Sphira, one of whom has been in Australia the whole time, one of whom traveled from New York to Australia.
Oh.
So neither of them counted or were obligated to count from the second day of Pesach, technically. They're still going to keep Shavuos on different days. Why? Because even though they didn't actively maximize the opportunity, when it comes to our individual journeys, right? So they're a part of, let's say, our relationship with Torah is identical for everyone, right? Shavuos is given on the 6th day, regardless of who, what, when, where, and otherwise. It is what it is. That's the same for everyone. Then there is the passage of time. The passage of time is not something that we do. It's something that happens. But it's something that can, and crossing the date line is an example where we get to see this, can happen differently for different people relative to the date on the calendar. Which means that in our individual journeys and relationships with Torah, there are also parts of that maybe we don't entirely control, but they're still individual, they're still unique. Which means that looking at someone else's relationship with Hashem and someone else's relationship with Torah is a terrible thing on which to base our own. Now, is there a place for saying, wow, I'm so inspired by where this person's at, I'd love to strive towards that? Absolutely. It's an incredible thing. It's a constructive thing if it's done with a healthy mindset. But that doesn't mean, but that being said, to look at someone else and say, well, oh, look at where they're up to and look at where I'm up to, and get miserable about it, well, it's like, you know what? Yeah, we both technically have the same opportunity at the level of, let's say, our spiritual genetics. The Torah happened on the 6th of Sivan for everyone. But the passage of time isn't necessarily the same, and we don't control that. So yes, we also, within that which happens to us that's not in our control, there are things that vary from person to person, or flip it over, same thing in the reverse. In terms of the things that vary from person to person, there are also things that are not in our control. And then there are things that are in our control, which why the Torah says, and you shall count. It doesn't just say, and you shall pass through 49 days and the 50th day will be. It says, and you shall count. Because whilst, yes, there is the layer of, let's say, circumstances which are the same for everyone. We all have equal right and ownership of, an opportunity to a relationship with the Torah. Then there are things which vary from person to person that are not within our control. The bottom line is, and this is where most of our energy should be focused, is ultimately we do have a tremendously substantial and influential ability to direct the course of our lives, to determine our actual experiential relationship with Hashem, our actual experiential relationship with the Torah. And that's why the Torah says, and you shall count for yourself. And all of these things are true. All of these things are part of the picture. And perhaps, I'm just really going out on a limb here. I'm thinking out loud. Just to clarify, going back to the nature versus nurture, perhaps it would be something along the lines of the Torah was given on a certain day, Hashem gave it to us. We don't say our receiving the Torah, it's the day of Hashem giving the Torah. Hashem gave it to all of us equally, right? And that is a thing where it is what it is, period. It doesn't vary. Now, it's not quite the case, but let's say to an extent that's something like our genetics, which is invariable, period. It is what it is for life. Then there's the passage of time, which is individual, but we don't control it, right? And here it might be something like, even if you have two 100% identical twins, hypothetically, I don't think it exists, but if you had two twins who are 100% genetically identical, and they were, brought up in different homes, identical genetics, there's going to be a lot of similarities and resemblance and a lot of difference between them. Right? So there's the genetics, then there are the things that happen to us, our circumstances in which we grow up, etc., which we don't have control over, but they vary tremendously can vary tremendously from person to person. Like the passage of time. Two people, same place, Shavuos on different days, even if they both did or both didn't count Sphira, it doesn't matter because it's not in our control. But ultimately, there is an enormous part of our life over which it is up to us to make decisions, to put in the effort, to be intentional and conscious about where we want to go and what it takes to get there, and therefore what we should and must do if we want to move things in that direction. And this is why the Torah tells us, yes, time, the passage of time depends on how many days you experienced, but it's not just the passage of time. The time will pass, but you have an obligation and a responsibility and an opportunity to count those days. Now, usefartem, which means count, sapphire, something that's brilliant and shines and beautiful. Sfartem is a verb. We shall count, we shall make brilliant and luminous and beautiful. It's up to us to proactively make use of the equal opportunity we have in that we all have the same right and ownership over Torah. We have different journeys within that, and then it's up to us to actively count and to make them bright and beautiful and luminous. We're going to steal 30 to 60 seconds very briefly because there's one more thing here that just wow. So the Torah says, and you shall count 7 weeks. Osfatem lachem, sheva shabosos, 7 weeks. How many days in 7 weeks? 49 days. And then it says, Tisbru chamishim yom, the sentence finishes off, you shall count 50 days. Well, which one is it? 7 weeks is not 50 days. Practically, how many days do we count? We don't count 50, we count 49. But when you count 49, you position yourself to get to day 50. Wow. When we proactively pursue the maximization of the equal opportunities that we have and the individual opportunities that we have, and we count them, we make them bright and luminous and beautiful, we are proactively putting ourselves in a position to receive an outcome that is beyond our capacity to make. We don't count the 50th day. It is not countable by us. It's only available to Hashem to give. But when we count the 49, we've effectively counted the 50th, because the counting of the 49 puts us in a position to get it. There are things in life that we cannot generate. You cannot generate happiness. And the pursuit of happiness is the saddest thing, because it's inherently self-defeating by definition. Like pursuing honor and respect. If you look for respect, that is the last thing that's going to make people respect you. It's just the way it is. Pursuing happiness is inherently self-defeating, because pursuing happiness doesn't make us happy. Being involved and engaged in the things we know to be true and bigger than ourselves is what brings happiness. You cannot make happiness, but you can do the things you need to do which will position you to have happiness, which you cannot get for yourself. So you can't create it, but ultimately you can get to it by doing the things that position you to receive